There is no substitute for India. If India is not good enough to hold China back, who else? Bhutan?
Will India, in fact, be central to a future world where the West and its values may be a sideshow? And that core question, could the 21st century be the Indian century? Dr. Quraishi, let's start with you.
Well, in one word, without doubt.
That's 2 words.
Yeah, 2 words. I agree. Now, I actually represent India in the sense that when India became independent, I was born 2 months before that. And I take credit that Gandhi and Nehru and Patel took 30 years to get us independence. I gave you in 2 months. So, but history of India and my history coincide. I'm, as they say, midnight child, and I have seen India grow. There was a time when India's Prime Minister going to the USA will be mentioned in 2 lines on the 11th page. Not anymore. So India cannot be taken lightly. India has become virtually a superpower of Southeast Asia in any case, and the world. And we saw in G20 how world leaders were queuing up to shake hands and take pictures with Mr. Modi. Now that we are the 5th largest economy, right in our time. I remember when I grew up, we were dependent on wheat donated by America under a program called PL 480. For years, we ate that wheat and flour. But now we are exporting food grains. We are economic big power, and it hasn't happened just like that. There has been great leadership. And one important point I do like to mention, that Pakistan, Bangladesh, India became independent at the same time. But look at them and look at us. What is the difference? The political leadership that we had with the vision and foresight. Those guys fell into military hands, and you know where they are. So therefore, political leadership made so much of difference, and we hope in future also India will be taken lightly. And if you allow me, last sentence. There was not a time when, oh, India is not behaving, so okay, forget about India, let us make friends with Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka. Where is the comparison? There are 90 countries rolled into one in India. There is no substitute for India. Who else? If India is not good enough to hold China back, who else? Bhutan? Nepal? So therefore, we have to be realistic that there is no alternative, no option. And if I was the Prime Minister, I will play this game that whether hate it or love it, you cannot afford to ignore India, because that is the only country which can stand up to China.
Thanks very much indeed, Dr. Quraishi. I think that beeping is the ambassador of Bhutan, who has come here violently to protest that particular statement. But we may get to him in the question and answer sessions. Thank you very much for starting us off in such rousing fashion. And let's turn now, Kate Sullivan de Estrada. Kate, to you. What's your take on this question? Indian century or not? And are those values ones that universalize between the West and India, or should we think about them separately?
Well, Dr. Qureishi's just given us his very powerful and very personal India story. But actually, I think I'm curious about this anxiety about whether the West will be a sideshow. Because this question, I think, comes from a place of seeing India as a canvas in Western countries on which to project anxieties about the future of our liberal order, and also our aspirations to preserve that order. We're asking questions about, will India be an ally against China? What is India's position on Russia? Because those topics seem to be a bit of a test of values, a test of do we have this shared liberal identity? But I think it's, thinking of your pitch, Rana, this question about India's attachment to freedom and democracy, that seems particularly fraught, again, in Western capitals, for Western governments, because I think that there's a lot of questions about if India is democratically backsliding. I think most of us agree it is. What can Western governments do, if anything, to shape India's political future? And there are a number of contradictions I just want to pull out on that. I mean, first of all, you mentioned the democracy rankings. India is falling in democracy rankings, but the current ruling regime in New Delhi doesn't care. It doesn't care about these rankings. They are cast as external criticism. And they're actually galvanizing, I think, what my colleague Kira Huyu calls post-colonial populists. So these are populists who reject a kind of colonial or neo-colonial West, and are using these rankings as kind of evidence that India is being bad named and that there's an agenda behind that. The reaction to that is that Western governments, I think, have stopped criticizing India's democracy, at least officially. The Western media is. And so we have this curious situation where India is being elevated in the Quad, which is a grouping of democracies. It's attending summit, been headlined at summits, G7 summit, the Summit for Democracies, which pivot on shared democratic identity. And there's a way in which I think this moment is legitimizing India really under a leadership that perhaps many have questions about.
Thanks very much indeed, Kate. Just to say, many here will know, but the Quad is a joint naval agreement between India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. And you've mentioned post-colonial populists. Presumably for short, they're not Cocoa Pops, but Poco Pops. That's the way to think of them. Alpa, key question here. Indian century or not? And how about this issue of whether values converge or diverge? Your thoughts?
Absolutely. I'm in agreement with Dr. Quraishi that this is the Indian century moving ahead. But I don't agree with the binaries of the proposition at the heart of this question, West versus India. What is at stake right now in India is an idea of India. And there are very many competing ideas of India. And crucially, there is the idea of India, which is at the moment very powerful, which is an authoritarian regime which has been incarcerating professors, students, journalists, democratic rights activists from all over the country, working on all kinds of issues, trying to protect democratic rights in far corners of the country. And these are the kinds of people whose idea of India is being imprisoned at the moment, which actually has a long history, that the democratic idea of India has a long history in India, which is, born with the Midnight's Children, but before that too. And what we have right now is, Western countries, our governments actually allying forces with what is essentially a very authoritarian regime and a very authoritarian prime minister. And what we need to be doing here in the West is drawing attention to the other idea of India, which is being incarcerated everywhere in India. Chief ministers of states in prison during an election campaign, and I just, since this is, there's an absolute coincidence in the title of this festival and in a little passage of my book, which is about the incarceration of democratic rights activists in India. And it's titled How Light Gets In. And I get the title from actually a man called Gautam Navlakha, a journalist of one of India's best magazines, Economic and Political Weekly, for 30 years, who found himself incarcerated with 16 other journalists, professors, lawyers, human rights activists, and completely cooked up charges since 2018. And he, as he is about to go to prison, writes a passage in one of India's online news venues where democratic rights spaces are being preserved in India at the moment. And he says, "Now that I have to surrender within 3 weeks, I ask myself, dare I hope to be freed from the burden of being accused in what appears to me to be yet another conspiracy trial, one more in the long list of such trials? Will the co-accused and others like them get their freedom back?" These questions creep in because of the times we live in, where civil liberties are getting progressively squeezed and where only one narrative dominates, backed by crassness in public life. So I am aware that I am joining the ranks of thousands of others who are made to suffer for their convictions. Gautam continued, to draw an analogy from Test cricket, which to me is the best form of cricket, where endurance, patience, fair play, grit and redemption grace the game. It is these same virtues that I demand from myself in this test match of my life. There is nothing more pressing than for me to clear my name. To my friends, colleagues, and family, I cannot thank you enough for standing by me through this period. I remain in your debt. Do please listen to Leonard Cohen sing the anthem, and remember to ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how light gets in. Thank you.
Alpa, thank you very much for that very stirring introductory comment. And actually, I'm also not only moved, obviously, by that statement by someone who has suffered a great deal for democratic values, but also delighted that the metaphor he chose to use was cricket. And the test match of my life is the phrase that he uses there. And I want to use that, if I may, to start off our debate and discussion with a bit of historical and cultural background before we come to some of the contemporary issues. Because one of the questions we're asking is whether or not India actually is going to stick to various ideas that are billed as being Western values, although how Western they are, I think, is a moot question. Cricket might certainly count as something that emerges, perhaps, in the Western world, but certainly gets globalized. But moving beyond that, Kate, I want to start with you with international relations.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.